What is the worth of $40? For most people, it is a tank of gas, a bag of groceries, maybe a small gift for someone they love. But what if those $40 given away when you were holding on by your last thread were not a loss at all, but the beginning of a miracle written long before you ever knew your own part in it? This is the story of Amber Collins, a young waitress fighting exhaustion medical bills and the fear of losing the only family she has left. It is the story of an old man wrapped in a frayed gray coat, carrying nothing but trembling hands and a sadness too deep for words. And it is the story of a choice so small it should have vanished into the noise of an ordinary day. But instead, that choice became a doorway. A moment of grace that unlocked a truth worth more than wealth, more than comfort, more than anything Amber could have imagined. Stay with us as we uncover how $40 given to a stranger became the final question in a test she never knew she was taking. A test that would change her life, her brother's future, and the destiny of countless others. The winter morning in Silver Ridge, a mountain town tucked beneath the snow-draped peaks of northern Colorado, arrived with the quiet solemnity of a hymn. A thin veil of frost clung to every window pane, the kind that caught the light like powdered diamonds. The streets were hushed, save for the distant hum of a logging truck climbing the icy hill or the occasional bark of a dog eager for warmth. Silver Ridge always felt suspended between two worlds, half rooted in old timber traditions, half yearning for something gentler, something slower. On mornings like this, it breathed in long, frozen sighs, carrying with them the scent of burning pine wood and cold metal. The Blue Pine Diner, a weather-beaten building with a flickering neon sign and a roof that liked to groan during storms, sat at the edge of Main Street like an aging storyteller, still proud, still standing, even if its bones creaked. Inside, the air was warmer but equally worn, carrying decades of spilled syrup, fried bacon, old laughter, and half-forgotten secrets trapped between wooden floorboards. It was here that Amber Collins, 28 years old, pale-skinned with a soft scattering of freckles and thick chestnut-brown hair tucked into a low ponytail, began her day as she always did, with fatigue wrapped around her like an invisible shawl. Amber was neither tall nor short, but carried a quiet presence, the kind of woman whose exhaustion lived behind her hazel eyes, but whose kindness refused to be dimmed. Her hands were small, steady, and often cold from stepping outside to clear snow off customers' windshields, something she did without thinking. She was known in Silver Ridge for a gentleness that seemed older than her years, though those who knew her well few, as they were, understood that this softness didn't come from ease. It came from hardship that had carved survival into her bones. The hardest part of her life was Evan Collins, her 14-year-old younger brother, a boy small for his age, with sandy brown hair, pale winter blue eyes, and a heart that refused to beat the way it should. Evan was born with a congenital defect, a twist of fate that meant hospital beds instead of ball games, pill bottles instead of birthday candles, and medical bills that piled like fresh snow with no sign of thaw. Evan was cheerful despite it all, sweet-witty and endlessly curious, but his lungs tired too easily and his smile sometimes faltered when he thought Amber wasn't looking. Their parents were long gone, one lost to illness, the other to grief, leaving Amber to shoulder everything with a determination fierce enough to break and mend her 1,000 times over. The diner was her battlefield, her refuge, her lifeline. This morning she moved between tables in worn black sneakers, carrying steaming plates to men in flannel jackets and women warming hands around coffee mugs. Outside, fat flakes of new snow drifted down in slow spirals. Inside, the radio hummed old country songs like faded memories. And then the bell above the door chimed softly, almost apologetically. The man who stepped inside was like a ghost blown in from the cold. Mr. Nolan Gray, though Amber did not yet know his name, was a thin, almost fragile-looking elder in his late 70s, with a narrow frame swallowed inside a frayed gray overcoat whose sleeves had been restitched more times than the diner's checkered curtains. He stood about 5'9", but seemed shorter, as if a lifetime of disappointments had pressed upon his shoulders until they bent. His silver hair was uncombed more like wind-blown frost than hair, and it stuck out in unruly wisps from beneath a flat wool cap. His face was a map of deep lines etched from years that had not been kind. There was a tremor in his hands, not constant but noticeable, the kind that made one wonder if he had eaten enough lately. But it was his eyes that captured Amber's attention, a washed-out pale blue, glassy with age and fatigue, yet carrying a profound heaviness, a century's worth of sorrow in a single look. Those eyes seemed to search the room, not for a place to sit, but for permission to exist. His demeanor spoke of someone who tried not to disturb the world, the kind of man who apologized even when he hadn't done anything wrong. "Good morning," Sir Amber said gently, stepping forward with a practiced but sincere smile. "Come on in out of the cold. Sit anywhere you like." The old man hesitated before shuffling toward a stool at the counter. Every movement looked deliberate slow, as if he feared his body might betray him with a wrong step. Amber set a menu in front of him and poured a glass of water. "Coffee's fresh," she offered. His gaze lifted to hers with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Coffee," he rasped. His voice was thin, brittle, like dry leaves. "Just coffee. Black." She poured it into a thick ceramic mug, the steam rising in delicate swirls. He wrapped his trembling fingers around it as though it were the only warm thing he'd held in a long time. He didn't open the menu, didn't glance around. He simply stared into the inky surface of the coffee as though he were looking into some distant memory he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. Amber returned to wiping counters and refilling condiments. The diner had quieted again. A couple of truckers chatted in low voices at a booth. An old hound, Scout, the owner's dog, a gray-muzzled Labrador mix about 11 years old, slept by the coat rack, his fur shedding in soft tufts. Scout was lazy but loyal, known for offering warm weight against anyone sitting alone too long. But even Scout didn't stir when the old man entered. He only raised his head, sniffed, and lowered it again, as if sensing the visitor carried a kind of sadness he didn't know how to comfort. Nearly an hour passed before the old man finally lowered the mug empty. His hands drifted shakily toward his coat pockets. First one, then the other. His expression shifted, surprise, confusion, then a flush of panic. He searched frantically, patting his chest, his sides the worn lining of his coat. His breath hitched. "Is everything all right?" Amber asked softly, stepping closer. The old man swallowed hard. I seem to have misplaced my wallet. I thought I had a few dollars." He tried to stand, nearly knocking over the empty mug. I can come back. I live nearby." "I didn't mean to." Amber's heart tightened. She had seen this kind of embarrassment only a few times, but she knew its taste, bitter, humiliating, heavy enough to crush a person's pride. She thought of the overdue rent notice folded in her apron pocket. She thought of Evan's medical bills sitting in a disorganized pile by the toaster at home. She thought of how many times she had counted and recounted the same few dollars, wishing they could stretch further. She saw that same fear mirrored in the man's pale blue eyes. "It's okay," she said gently. "Just a cup of coffee today. Don't worry about it." "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I couldn't possibly." But Amber was already plucking the small paper check from the counter, $1.75. She crumpled it with a smooth, practiced motion and tossed it into the trash behind her. "It's on the house," she said with a small smile. Then, without letting the moment stretch into pity, she walked to the register, slipped 2 worn $1 bills from her own tip money, and paid for the coffee herself. When she turned back, the old man was watching her with a strange intensity, a quiet, unblinking scrutiny, as though he were memorizing every detail of her face. Not in a way that unsettled her, but in a way that felt important somehow, as though she had just answered a question he had carried for a very long time. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. "Thank you," he whispered. "You are very kind." He rose from the stool with care, placed his cap back atop his wisps of silver hair, and gave her a small, old-fashioned nod, almost courtly. Then he turned toward the door. The bell gave a soft chime as he left, swallowed by the swirl of falling snow. Amber stood quietly watching him disappear down Main Street until he became just another gray figure in a gray morning. Behind her, Scout lifted his head again, gave a soft, low whine, as if sensing a shift in the air, subtle but irreversible. Amber didn't know why, but as she wiped the counter where the old man had sat, she felt an odd stirring, not of fear, not of regret, but of something warmer, something like peace, a small kindness in a cruel winter, a choice so small it should have meant nothing. Yet it felt strangely like the beginning of something she could not yet name. The week after the snowy morning encounter unfolded slowly like pages turning under a hesitant hand, and Silver Ridge found itself buried under deeper winter. The mountains encircling the town stood tall and severe, as though carved from cold stone rather than earth, their peaks veiled in steel-gray clouds. The air bit harder now, stinging the skin with each breath. At the Blue Pine Diner, icicles clung stubbornly to the gutters, chiming faintly whenever a gust shook them. Amber Collins, wrapped in her faded navy apron and a borrowed cardigan too thin for the cold, moved through her morning routine with an exhaustion that threatened to bend her spine. But she kept going, she always did. She had no choice. Evan had suffered 2 nights of shallow breathing, the kind that made his chest rise unevenly, the white of his eyes showing too much whenever pain hit. Amber hadn't slept much. She lived in a constant state of half-alertness, like a deer scanning for rustling bushes, never resting fully always, waiting for something to go wrong. Inside the diner, life continued its ordinary rhythm. Scout the old dog snored beside the coat rack. The coffee machine gurgled like it was clearing its throat. A couple of local teachers chatted about school closures over blueberry pancakes, and then the bell above the door chimed again this time, sharper as if announcing something unusual. Mr. Nolan Gray stepped inside. He wore the same frayed gray coat, though today it hung off him more loosely, as though age had nibbled another corner of him since last week. His cap was dusted with fresh snow, his cheeks flushed from the biting wind. Amber blinked in surprise. She had wondered about him, whether he'd found his wallet, whether he had eaten since that day, whether he remembered her kindness, or would simply become another face drifting unnoticed through her life. But here he was, again shuffling toward the same stool at the counter. Amber approached with a gentle smile. "Back for coffee, sir, yes?" He rasped his pale eyes, flicking up with something unreadable. "Black, please." She poured it without hesitation, the mug warm under her fingers. He wrapped his trembling hands around it again, drawing it close as though it were the only warmth left in the world. Just as she turned to move away, she heard a clatter. The salt shaker had tipped over. Salt spilled in a small glittering hill across the counter's edge. Nolan blinked rapidly and apologized under his breath. "I'm terribly sorry." "My hands, they don't behave," Amber reassured him softly. "It's all right, sir." She reached for a cloth, but before she even wiped the first grain away, another clatter sounded. This time the sugar dispenser, the glass kind with a metal top, rolled off its place and hit the floor with a dull thud. The lid popped open, and white crystals skidded everywhere across the old linoleum tiles. Nolan let out a groan from deep in his chest. "No, no, no, I'm so sorry." I didn't mean my hands." His voice cracked with humiliation. Amber sighed, not with anger, but with tiredness. Her back ached from lifting heavy trays that morning. Her headache pulsed behind her temples. But when she looked up at his face, she saw something fragile fear, perhaps. Shame, a lifetime of it. She exhaled slowly. "It's okay," she said, kneeling down with the dustpan. "Everyone has clumsy days." As she worked, she felt his eyes on her. Not in a predatory way, no. It was something else. Quiet, intent, as if he were studying not her actions, but the spirit behind them. When she stood again, brushing sugar grains off her apron, Nolan whispered another apology and lowered his gaze. Amber simply smiled and moved on. She didn't notice the man who had been watching from near the back wall. He stood out sharply against the diner's cozy, worn-in atmosphere, Daniel Brooks, though she did not yet know his name. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with an angular build that fit his charcoal gray suit perfectly. His hair was dark and neatly combed his jaw, clean-shaven his eyes, a cool shade of gray that gave away nothing. He looked to be in his mid-40s with the posture of someone accustomed to control. There was a restraint in him, a quietness that seemed deliberate, like a man trained to observe before speaking. He held a slim leather portfolio tucked under his arm, and his shoes, black and polished, made him seem entirely out of place among the muddy boots and snow-crusted jackets of Silver Ridge locals. Daniel watched Amber from a distance, his expression unreadable. He didn't touch the menu. He didn't sip his coffee. He only watched his eyes following the way Amber wiped the counter, crouched to clean the sugar, reassured the old man. Each movement seemed to register in him as though they were clues in a puzzle. For almost an hour he sat there. Scout the dog wandered close to sniff him once before retreating. The man smelled of city air and expensive cologne, not the kind of scent Scout knew how to trust. Meanwhile, Amber continued working unaware of the stranger's silent assessments. What she did notice was the sudden vibration of her phone in her apron pocket. Amber rarely checked it while working, but something about the persistent buzzing made her palm cold before she even looked. It was the hospital. Her heart seized. She answered in a whisper. "Hello." A nurse's voice came through, calm but brisk. "Miss Collins, it's about Evan." His breathing became unstable during morning rounds. "We need you to come as soon as possible." Her world shrank into a tight tunnel. Is he okay?" "He's stable for now, but struggling. The doctor believes he needs further evaluation." Amber felt her knees weaken. She murmured a choked "thank you," hung up, and immediately approached her manager, Louise Harding, a woman in her early 50s with a square jaw, sharp eyes, and the personality of someone who'd spent too many years fighting with suppliers and balancing tight margins. Louise wasn't unkind by nature, but she was hardened divorce debt, and running the diner alone had carved into her a constant sense of urgency. Louise Amber said, breath trembling, "I need to go. It's Evan." The hospital called. Louise stiffened, her brows pulled together. "Now, Amber, it's lunch rush." "I know, but he can't breathe right, Amber." Louise's voice softened just a fraction, but only a fraction. "You already left early last Sunday, and last month, and the month before that." Amber swallowed tears stinging her eyes. "I can't stay. He needs me." Louise exhaled long and hard, looked between Amber and the growing crowd of customers, then nodded stiffly. "Go. But this is your last warning. I can't keep the diner running short-staffed." Amber didn't argue. She grabbed her coat, breath hitched, and pushed through the diner's front door into the icy air. She didn't notice Daniel Brooks watching the entire scene, nor did she see him reach into his jacket and jot down a brief note on a small discreet notepad. She didn't see Mr. Nolan Gray lift his pale eyes to watch her leave, either his knuckles white on the edge of the counter. All she felt was fear as she raced toward her car boots, sliding on patches of ice. The hospital was 10 minutes away. 10 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Back inside, the diner felt strangely quiet after Amber's hurried departure. Daniel watched the door slowly swing closed, then shifted his cool gaze to Mr. Nolan. The old man met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then looked away quickly, almost nervously. Daniel rose from his seat, placed a neatly folded bill beneath his untouched cup, and walked toward the exit with the silent certainty of a man who already knew more than he let on. Nolan stayed behind, staring into his empty mug as if the dark liquid still held some reflection of amber in its depths. The storm over Silver Ridge seemed to grow heavier the next few days, both in the sky and in Amber Collins' chest. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the town as though nature itself wanted to muffle every sound, every worry, every heartbeat. But nothing could quiet the whirlwind inside her as she hurried through hallways, supermarket aisles, and the Blue Pine Diner with a mind stretched too thin to breathe. Evan had been kept at the hospital overnight for observation, and Amber's anxiety never fully left her lungs. The boy's breathing had stabilized, but the doctor insisted on more tests. The word tests always carried a terrifying weight in their lives. Tests meant evaluations, numbers charts, and usually a storm of bills afterward. That morning, the diner felt strangely subdued. Outside, the mountain wind howled like some ancient creature pacing the ridge. Inside, Scout lay curled in his usual spot, his tail giving only the faintest twitch whenever the door chimed. Amber entered the diner late still, wearing her heavy winter coat, because the chill had seeped all the way into her bones. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, and dark circles shadowed the undercurrent of quiet fear in her hazel eyes. Louise Harding, her manager, simply gave her a long look, stern but with a faint softening around the edges, as though she was close to scolding and comforting at the same time. Yet she said nothing as Amber clocked in. The morning rush faded into a slow lull around 11 a.m. when the bell chimed again. Amber turned toward the sound instinctively and felt her stomach drop with a mixture of surprise and unease. Mr. Nolan Gray had returned. This time, instead of heading to the counter, he walked slowly, painfully slowly, toward the corner booth, a little alcove, half hidden by a wooden pillar carved with old initials and dates. The booth was bathed in soft winter light, diffused through the frosted window, making the old man look almost spectral. His gray overcoat seemed even more worn than before, fraying at the elbows, the seams loose. His posture slumped deeper as though each step tugged sadly on his spine. His face was drawn pale, carrying the kind of strain that made every wrinkle more pronounced. Yet his blue eyes, though clouded, held something else today. Something trembling, something like desperation. Amber approached cautiously. "Good morning, sir," she said gently. "Coffee, please," he whispered. She poured it, setting the mug before him, but instead of grasping it, Mr. Nolan pressed both hands flat on the table as though grounding himself. "Miss Collins." He hesitated, voice quivering. "May I speak frankly with you?" Amber blinked unsure. "Of course." Nolan lifted his gaze to her, and she saw moisture glinting at the corners of his eyes, not dramatic, but the quiet, defeated kind of sadness that belongs to people who have suffered in silence far too long. "It's my granddaughter," he began. "Lila? She turns 8 today." He swallowed hard. His voice was barely audible, thin as paper. "I had saved up $50, enough for a small gift. Something she wanted, a bracelet with little silver stars." His lips trembled as he continued. "But I lost the money, somewhere on the bus. And now I have nothing to give her." Amber felt her chest tighten. "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't expect you to fix this," Nolan said quickly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "But I hoped. Could I perhaps borrow $20? I will repay it next week. I promise. I swear on my life I will." Amber froze. $20? She opened her wallet slowly, knowing exactly what she would find. $45. a crinkled 20 a 10, and a collection of worn 5s and singles. $45 that stood between her and everything collapsing. It was gas money for the week, gas she needed to reach the hospital each day. It was the prescription refill Evan needed because his breathing medicine would run out tomorrow night. It was the tiny buffer she clung to while balancing on the crumbling ledge that was her life. And yet, she looked at Nolan's trembling hands, at the despair in his eyes, at the way he seemed to brace himself against the weight of being a disappointment to a child he clearly adored. She understood that ache too well, the fear of failing someone you love more than your own existence. She reached into her wallet. Her fingers shook. Her breath stuttered. She pulled out 2 $20 bills. "Sir?" "Here." She placed them gently in front of him. "This is 40. A little girl deserves something special for her birthday." Nolan's mouth fell open, stunned. I only asked for 20. "I know," Amber whispered, her throat tight, "but today should be happy for her." Nolan stared at the bills as though they were not money, but salvation. He reached forward, hesitated, then took them with trembling reverence. His pale blue eyes glimmered with something Amber couldn't decipher. "Miss Collins," he said slowly, voice thickening with emotion. You don't know what you've done." She smiled weakly. "It's all right." The old man extended a shaky hand, but instead of shaking hers, he lightly clasped her wrist, his warm fingers pressing gently against her cold skin. "You are a rare soul," he murmured. "This world does not deserve you." Then he released her, stood up straighter than she had ever seen him, and walked slowly out of the diner, leaving Amber stunned, breathless, and now $40 poorer. As she watched him disappear into the swirling snow, something inside her cracked, not from regret, but from fear. She had just given away the last thread holding her life together, and yet a strange calmness washed through her chest like a candle flickering in a dark room. A foolish, impossible hope. But life did not pause for her small moment of courage. That afternoon at the hospital, she sat beside Evan's bed while a new doctor reviewed his chart. Dr. Mason Hale, in his mid-30s, stood with a tall, lean frame that seemed too big for the tiny pediatric room. He had sandy blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, and tired but compassionate brown eyes, eyes that hinted at someone who had seen too many children endure too much. He spoke with a calm, low voice that bore both authority and empathy. "Miss Collins," he began, tapping the folder lightly. "I've reviewed Evan's history, his breathing episodes. They're becoming more frequent." Amber swallowed. "Is it bad?" "It's manageable," he said carefully. "But I'm concerned he never received the corrective surgery he needed when he was younger." Amber's stomach twisted. He continued gently. "Without surgical intervention, his heart may continue to weaken." "How much does the surgery cost?" Amber whispered. Dr. Hale hesitated, and Amber knew the answer before he even spoke. "It's expensive," he finally said. "Very expensive, but we will explore every option." She nodded, tears burning her eyes. Evan looked up at her from the bed, small, pale, but smiling. "It's okay, Amber," he whispered. "I'm tough." Amber kissed his forehead, but her heart felt like shattering glass. She left the hospital late that evening, exhausted beyond measure. Snowflakes clung to her lashes as she walked to her car. The $40 she gave away felt like a distant dream, now beautiful and foolish in equal measure. And yet, beneath the crushing fear, she felt something else, something like the quiet rumble of destiny shifting beneath her feet. For 3 days, the Blue Pine Diner felt strangely hollow, as if something unseen had shifted its atmosphere. The winter wind continued to batter Silver Ridge, rattling window panes and howling through the mountain passes. But inside the diner, the silence left in Mr. Nolan Gray's absence created a different kind of chill. Amber Collins worked her shifts with a mechanical precision born of exhaustion. Her mind was split endlessly between worries about Evan, who had been kept under close monitoring, and the gnawing fear that the $40 she'd given away was the first domino in a chain of collapse she could no longer stop. Each morning she looked toward the door when the bell chimed, expecting the old man's frail silhouette. Each time it wasn't him, her breath tightened. She tried to hide it, but Scout the diner's elderly Labrador mix noticed. He started resting his head on her shoe whenever she stood still, too long, offering quiet comfort in his gentle gray-muzzled way. On the third day, during the slow afternoon lull, the bell chimed again. Amber turned instinctively and froze. It wasn't Nolan. Instead, Daniel Brooks walked in with the same quiet confidence he carried last week, the polished aura of a man who never stepped anywhere without purpose. His suit today was charcoal black, impeccably tailored, paired with a dark navy tie that added an air of severity. Tall and broad-shouldered, with cool gray eyes and a calm, closed-off expression, Daniel looked like someone who lived in a world built on structure, order, and expensive silence. His posture was straight as a steel beam, his shoes barely making a sound on the worn diner floor. A leather briefcase hung at his side. "Can I help you?" Amber asked cautiously. He approached the counter. "Yes, I'm looking for Amber Collins." His voice was steady, deep, and unmistakably authoritative. Amber straightened. "That's me." Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if confirming something. Then he spoke with crisp, formal clarity. "Miss Collins, the CEO of Graylight Industries, would like to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at our Denver headquarters." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Amber blinked, stunned. I think you have the wrong person." Daniel shook his head, once hardly emotion. "No, I don't. But Graylight, the Graylight Industries." "That's the largest conglomerate in Colorado," he finished for her. His tone wasn't boastful, merely factual. "Yes, and the CEO has requested your presence personally." Amber's throat tightened. "Why, I don't know anyone from Graylight." Daniel's features softened only slightly, as if he recognized the confusion, but was unwilling to reveal anything further. "All your questions will be answered at the meeting. Transportation costs will be covered. Don't be late." He placed a sleek business card on the counter. Thick stock, embossed lettering. The address printed in sharp silver foil, Denver Skyline Tower, 60th floor. Amber stared at it as though it might disappear. When she looked up again, Daniel Brooks was already at the door, stepping back into the cold without another word. Louise Harding emerged from the kitchen just in time to see his retreating figure. "Well," she muttered, eyebrows raised skeptically. "What was that about? Did one of your customers finally discover you're secretly royalty?" Amber forced a nervous laugh. "I don't know." But she knew one thing. Nothing about this felt normal. The next morning arrived far too quickly. Amber barely slept. Her night was a storm of anxious thoughts, unanswered questions, and worry for Evan. Denver lay 2 hours from Silver Ridge, and she woke before sunrise to the sound of snow sliding off the roof. Her breath fogged as she changed into the nicest outfit. She owned a simple black skirt and a cream-colored blouse ironed 3 times to push the wrinkles out. Her coat was old but clean. Her boots were scuffed but sturdy. She felt like someone preparing for a world she didn't belong in. The drive to Denver was long and tense. The highway wound through the mountains, then unfurled across open fields until the city's skyline appeared gleaming glass towers rising sharply into the pale winter sky. And at the center of them stood Denver Skyline Tower, a skyscraper with vast mirrored windows that reflected the clouds like a stage-lighted palace of steel. Amber parked in a visitor lot, walked across the windswept plaza, and found herself standing before revolving doors taller than any she had ever seen. Her heart hammered as she stepped inside. The lobby was enormous, coldly elegant, a cathedral of glass and marble. The ceiling soared high above her, and sleek sculptures dotted the space like guardians of an alien world. The front desk receptionist, a woman in her 40s with flawless braids, emerald earrings, and a composed, efficient demeanor, looked up once Amber approached. "Good morning. Name A. Amber Collins," she managed. The woman typed, paused, then nodded respectfully. "You're cleared. Private elevator to the right. It's been keyed for the 60th floor." Amber swallowed hard and stepped into the elevator. It was silent, lined with dark polished wood, and ascended so quickly her ears popped. When the doors opened, she stepped into an office floor so expansive it felt unreal. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the entire city, sprawling beneath them like a map of possibilities and impossible dreams. A man stood waiting, not just any man. Mr. Nolan Gray, except no longer bent or trembling. He stood tall, about 5'11", straight-backed and dignified. His silver-gray hair was combed immaculately, shining under the soft overhead lights. His once cloudy blue eyes were now sharp and clear, carrying a depth that startled Amber. He wore a midnight blue suit, tailored so perfectly it moved like liquid when he turned. He looked powerful, composed, and impossibly far from the frail old man she had knelt beside while cleaning spilled sugar. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice strong, smooth, no longer trembling. "Thank you for coming." Her breath caught. "You—" "Yes," he answered. "It was me. All of it." Amber froze, unable to reconcile the two versions of him, the fragile stranger she'd helped, and this commanding presence, radiating authority. Nolan Gray's eyes softened with something like sorrow. "My name is Nolan Grayfield," he said quietly. "Founder and CEO of Graylight Industries?" Her pulse stuttered. Her knees threatened to give. "You're Nolan Grayfield, I am. But you—" The coat, the shaking? He nodded slowly, guilt flickering across his face. "Yes. That version of me was real in its own way, but not the whole truth. I needed to see something. I needed to find someone." Amber stared, overwhelmed fear and confusion colliding inside her. Nolan Grayfield stepped closer, his voice deepening. "You gave me coffee when you could barely afford your own bills. You cleaned up my spills when you were breaking under the weight of your life. And you gave away $40, your last $40, simply to keep a little girl's birthday from breaking her heart." His eyes glimmered. "I wanted to find one person who gave without expecting anything back, who would give even when they themselves had nothing." He held her gaze. "And I found you." For a long moment, the silence in Nolan Grayfield's vast office felt almost sacred, as though the city below had stopped breathing just to listen. Amber Collins stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly against her skirt, her pulse beating in her throat. She was still trying to reconcile the two versions of the same man, the frail old stranger in a frayed gray coat, and the powerful titan standing before her, now straight-backed eyes, sharp his midnight blue suit, fitting him with effortless command. Nolan moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his steps steady the light, casting a soft silver glow along the edges of his hair. From here, Denver looked like an intricate constellation, streets like rivers of light, tiny cars moving like sparks beneath a pale winter sun. He placed a hand lightly against the glass. When he spoke, his voice carried both gravity and something gentler. "There is a reason for all this, Miss Collins, a reason beyond business or charity, a reason born from grief and hope." Amber swallowed. Why me? Why all these tests? Nolan turned, and for the first time since she arrived, Amber saw a crack in his composure. Something human, tender, deeply wounded. "Because of Isabel," he said quietly. "My wife." He walked toward a framed photo on the shelf, one she hadn't noticed earlier. It showed a woman in her 30s with warm brown eyes and a smile that looked like it had known both laughter and sorrow. Her hair was wavy, tied back loosely, and she radiated a kind of unforced kindness. Nolan picked up the frame gently, as though touching something fragile. Isabel grew up with nothing. Poverty, illness, hunger. She knew them all. But she believed, truly believed, that the value of a person was not measured by what they accumulated, but by what they had the courage to give away. His voice softened. She once told me that kindness is the only currency that never loses value. He held the photo a moment longer. When she died 2 years ago, I was surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Investors, lobbyists, opportunists. Not one act of kindness was offered without strings. Nolan set the photo down and looked directly at Amber. I began to fear she had been wrong, that her world, a world where people helped each other simply because it was right, no longer existed. His jaw tightened with remembered pain. So I went searching for proof, not in boardrooms, not in charity galas, but where real life happens, diners, bus stops, sidewalks. I disguised myself, erased my name, and waited. His pale blue eyes warmed. Then I met you. Amber felt her throat tighten. She looked down, unsure how to absorb the weight of his words. Nolan continued, taking a step closer. You gave me coffee when you could barely afford your own bills. You cleaned my mess when you were shattered with exhaustion. And you gave away your last $40, your last thread of hope for a child you had never met. Not because you expected anything, but because your soul bends toward compassion. Amber blinked, tears welling. Anyone would have, Nolan said firmly. Most people wouldn't. But you did, even when you were drowning. He moved behind his desk, opened a drawer, and placed a thick folder on the table between them. Embossed on the cover in silver lettering were the words, "The Grayfield Hope Foundation." This, Nolan said, was Isabel's dream. A foundation dedicated not just to financial aid, but to restoring dignity, to finding the people who fall through cracks too deep for most to see. He slid the folder toward her. I want you to lead it. Amber's breath caught. Me? You have what all my executives lack, Nolan said simply. You understand suffering. You understand sacrifice. And you understand what it means to keep giving, even when you've reached the edge of everything. He continued, his voice steady, purposeful. I am offering you the position of executive director. Your starting salary will be $250,000 a year. You will have full authority to build the foundation according to Isabel's philosophy. Amber's legs went weak. She gripped the chair to steady herself. I don't know what to say. I'm not trained for something like this. Compassion cannot be taught, Nolan replied gently. Everything else can. He paused, then added, and there is more. Amber lifted her eyes. For a heartbeat, Nolan's expression softened with something close to paternal affection. The Foundation's first official act, he said slowly, is to assume full lifetime responsibility for Evan's medical care at any hospital in the world. The room tilted. Amber covered her mouth, a small sob, escaping before she could stop it. Nolan stepped back to give her space, his gaze steady, patient. She tried to speak, tried to form thank you, or how, or why, but the words tangled in her tears. For the first time in years, she felt the crushing weight inside her chest begin to loosen. Later that evening, Evan was airlifted to a premier cardiac hospital in Boston, accompanied by a medical team that moved with quiet, life-saving efficiency. Amber flew beside him, holding his hand as the jet sliced through cold skies. In Boston, he underwent surgery led by Dr. Lena Whitford, a renowned surgeon in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair, sharp intelligence, and the firm but warm presence of someone who had saved hundreds of children. She wore thin, rectangular glasses and spoke with a calm, precise voice that reassured without making false promises. 6 hours later, Evan emerged from surgery, weak, pale, but alive, and stronger than he had ever been. Amber spent days at his bedside watching the color slowly return to his cheeks, seeing him breathe without pain. When they finally returned to Silver Ridge, the winter sun looked warmer, as though the entire town exhaled in gratitude. The first thing Amber did was walk back into the Blue Pine Diner, where Scout greeted her by pressing his head against her leg. Louise stared at her in disbelief as Amber placed a white envelope on the counter, inside a $20,000 cashier's check. For repairs, Amber said softly, "New booths, a better stove, and maybe a real vacation for you someday." Louise, usually sharp, brisk, never emotional, covered her mouth as her eyes filled. A few days later, Amber stood again in Nolan's office, this time as his colleague, not a bewildered stranger. Snow fell softly beyond the windows. Nolan appeared from the doorway carrying 2 ceramic mugs, the same thick diner mugs he'd used in his disguise. He handed one to her, black coffee, steaming faintly. Amber accepted it with a small smile. She inhaled the aroma, warm and familiar. Nolan stood beside her, looking out over the sprawling city. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. The $40, Amber shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I think it was the best choice I ever made." She took a slow sip. Then, with a soft, knowing smile, she added, "Some cups of coffee aren't hot at all, but somehow they're warm enough to change an entire life." In the end, Amber's story reminds us of a quiet truth that lives beneath the noise of everyday life. Sometimes the smallest kindness we give away becomes the doorway through which a miracle enters. Some people call it fate, others call it chance. But many of us know it by another name. The gentle hand of God working in places we least expect. A cup of coffee, a trembling choice, a stranger with tired eyes. These moments look ordinary on the surface, but they carry the spark of something holy, something that whispers that God still moves through human hearts each day. So when you feel unseen, or when your kindness feels too small to matter, remember this story. Remember that God often uses simple acts to build extraordinary endings. Remember that your giving may become the miracle someone else has prayed for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the good still alive in this world. And if you believe that God still works through kindness, type Amen in the comments below. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps toward unexpected grace.